Take a deep breath, the tiny voice whispered. Little Amaya, the maid's sick toddler, stepped forward to hand the dying tycoon his inhaler, saving his life just when all hope seemed lost. She wasn't supposed to be in the mansion that day, but that one brave moment changed their futures forever. The Silverwood estate stood at the very top of a wind-swept hill, looking down at the town like a king on a throne. Its gates were always locked tight, and the stone walls were far too high for anyone to see inside. The mansion was a masterpiece of architecture, with marble floors that shined like glass and massive chandeliers that hung like frozen rain. Every corner of the house breathed luxury, yet it felt as hollow as a drum. Vincent, the owner of this sprawling home, walked slowly through the grand hallway. His footsteps were the only sound in the house, echoing loudly against the high ceilings. He wore a suit that cost more than a luxury car, but he didn't seem to notice. His face was a mask of cold stone. He glanced at the expensive paintings on the walls, but he didn't really see them. To him, they were just decorations in a prison of his own making. Years ago, these halls had been filled with music and laughter. He could almost hear the faint memory of his late wife's gentle hum and the sound of his little child's running feet playing hide and seek. But that was a lifetime ago. A terrible winter storm had taken them both away in a single freezing night, leaving Vincent with nothing but his money and his regrets. Since that day, he had turned his back on the world. He stopped going to parties, he stopped answering his phone, and most of all, he stopped letting people into his life. He sat down in his massive study, the leather chair feeling far too big for him. The fireplace was lit, crackling with a warmth that just couldn't reach his heart. Outside the sun was shining, but inside the air felt heavy and gray. He stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling gardens, but he felt no peace. He had built a golden cage, and he was the only prisoner inside. To the rest of the world, Vincent was a successful, lucky man who had everything he could ever want. But as he sat there in the crushing, heavy silence, he knew the painful truth. He was a man who had lost everything that actually mattered. Far away from the big, quiet mansion, Judith lived in a small, cramped apartment. The heater rattled and hummed, but it didn't keep the cold out. Judith was exhausted. She had worked long shifts for weeks to make enough money for rent and medicine. Every single penny she earned went toward taking care of her little daughter, Amaya. Amaya was only 3 years old, but she had been fighting a bad, rattling cough for days. Her warm brown skin looked pale, and her dark, curious eyes, usually so bright, were tired and cloudy. Judith sat on the edge of the old, worn-out sofa, gently stroking Amaya's thick, curly hair. The little girl let out a shaky breath. Her chest rose and fell in a way that made Judith's heart squeeze with fear. Judith looked at the calendar on the wall. Today was a required workday at the estate. If she didn't show up, she wouldn't get paid. If she didn't get paid, she couldn't afford the medicine the clinic had given her. The pressure was heavy. She had no family nearby, no friends to watch Amaya, and no money left to pay for a babysitter. She looked at her daughter's feverish face. "I'm so sorry, baby," she whispered, feeling tears in her eyes. She knew the rules at the estate were very strict. Employees were not allowed to bring guests, especially children. But she was out of options. She had to keep her job to keep Amaya safe. With a trembling hand, she wrapped Amaya in a thick wool blanket. She packed a small bag with water, the medicine, and a favorite old teddy bear. She decided she would try to sneak Amaya into the mansion and hide her in a quiet, empty room. She prayed that Vincent, the cold owner of the estate, would never find out. It was a risky, desperate plan, but Judith loved her daughter more than anything. She knew she had to do whatever it took to keep her little girl healthy. The journey to the estate felt miles long. Every bump in the bus made Amaya cough, and Judith gripped her hand tighter. When they finally arrived at the massive iron gates, Judith looked up at the towering house. It looked colder and more intimidating than ever before. She knew the rules. No guests. No exceptions. The head of the household staff, a stern woman named Mrs. Gable, was known for being incredibly strict. If Judith was caught, she wouldn't just lose a day's pay. She would be fired on the spot. Judith took a deep breath, trying to hide the fear in her eyes. Amaya was wrapped tightly in a thick coat, her breathing shallow and raspy. Judith walked around to the back entrance, hoping to avoid the watchful eyes of the security guards. She prayed that the delivery drivers were busy or that the staff was distracted. Luck was on her side. The service door was cracked open for a supply delivery. Judith slipped inside, holding Amaya close against her chest. The kitchen was busy with the clatter of pots and pans, but she moved quickly and quietly through the shadows. She knew the floor plan by heart. There was a small, dusty storage room tucked away in the back of the service wing. It wasn't fancy, but it was hidden from the main part of the house. She ushered Amaya inside and knelt on the cold floor. "Stay right here, sweetie," she whispered, smoothing the hair away from Amaya's forehead. "You have to be very quiet. Can you do that for Mommy?" Amaya nodded slowly, her eyes drooping with exhaustion. Judith set down a pillow and the small bag of supplies she had brought. She felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. Every sound in the hallway outside made her jump. She was risking everything, her career, her reputation, and her only source of income, just to keep her child safe. But looking at Amaya's small, shivering frame, Judith knew she had made the right choice. She gave her daughter a final reassuring squeeze and hurried out to begin her work, praying that no one would notice the secret guest hiding just down the hall. Vincent was alone in his expansive study, surrounded by rows of leather-bound books. He felt a sudden sharp tightness in his chest, like a cold hand squeezing his lungs. At first, he tried to ignore it, taking slow, deep breaths, but the air simply wouldn't come. His throat closed up tight. Panic, sharp and sudden, flared in his eyes. He stood up too quickly, knocking over a heavy glass paperweight from his desk. It hit the polished floor with a dull thud. Vincent stumbled, reaching for the small side table where he kept his inhaler. His hand trembled, his fingers brushing against the wood, but he was too weak. The inhaler skittered across the floor, sliding just out of his grasp. The silence of the house was shattered. Vincent let out a ragged, whistling gasp, a terrifying sound that tore through the quiet room. He clawed at his throat, his face turning an alarming shade of pale. He had never felt so vulnerable. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the expensive rug, his body fighting for every tiny breath of air. The world around him began to blur. The grand paintings and the high ceilings seemed to spin. Every second felt like an eternity. He wasn't just struggling to breathe. He was fighting to stay alive. The silence that he had cultivated for so long now felt suffocating. He realized with a jolt of terror that he was completely alone. There was no one nearby to hear him, no one to call for help, and his lungs were refusing to work. He lay on the floor, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with fear as the darkness started to creep in at the edges of his vision. He was trapped in his own home, and he was slipping away. Vincent is fighting for his life, and he is completely alone. Will he find the help he needs in time, or is this the end of his story? If you're on the edge of your seat and want to see if a miracle is about to happen, hit that subscribe button now. It helps us keep creating these stories of hope and second chances. Now, let's see what happens next. Amaya heard a strange, loud, whistling noise echoing from down the hallway. Her head felt heavy, and her cheeks were burning with a fever, but something about the sound frightened her. She pushed the heavy door of the dusty storage room open. It creaked loudly, but she didn't care. She wobbled on her small, unsteady legs into the grand hallway, following the scary noise. She found the door to the study standing wide open. Inside, she saw a man lying on the expensive rug. It was Vincent, the man her mother worked for. He was making frightening, wheezing sounds, clawing at his neck. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with panic. Amaya didn't know who he was really, but she knew what it felt like to not be able to breathe. She remembered when her own chest felt tight and heavy, and how her mother would always help her use her own medicine. Her dark eyes darted around the room and landed on a small, plastic tube sitting on the floor near the bookshelf. It looked just like the one she used when she felt sick. She walked toward it, her own breathing shallow and raspy. She picked it up with her tiny, shaking hands. She looked at the man on the floor. He was struggling, his eyes wild and frightened. Amaya walked over to him, her small feet moving slowly across the thick, soft rug. "Breathe," she whispered, her voice tiny and weak. She held the small plastic object out toward him. Vincent stopped moving. He stared up at the little girl, his vision blurred. He couldn't speak, but he saw the medicine in her small hands. With the last of his strength, he reached out and took the inhaler from her fingers. His hands shook as he pressed it to his mouth and took a deep, shaky puff. A moment passed, then another. The terrible whistling in his chest began to quiet down. His lungs finally filled with air. He lay there on the floor, gasping, looking up at the toddler who had saved his life. She stood there, swaying slightly, her own fevered eyes watching him with a quiet, innocent concern. The oppressive silence of the house had returned, but this time it felt different. Vincent leaned his head back against the leg of his heavy oak desk, his chest finally expanding with a deep, steady breath. The world stopped spinning. He looked down at the tiny girl sitting on the expensive rug beside him. Her curls were a mess, and her face was flushed with fever, yet her dark eyes were full of a calm, steady wisdom that he hadn't seen in years. He had lived behind high walls for so long, convinced that his wealth could protect him from the harshness of the world. He had treated people like background noise, mere shadows in his perfect, empty house. But as he studied this child, this little girl who was not supposed to be here, he felt a crack in his armor. She wasn't just a maid's daughter. She was a living, breathing soul who had risked her own comfort to offer him kindness. For the first time since the dark days of his past, he felt a flicker of something he thought was long gone. It wasn't the cold satisfaction of a business deal or the hollow pride of his status. It was gratitude. He reached out a trembling hand toward her, hesitant, not quite sure how to bridge the distance. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice raspy. Amaya just blinked, then tilted her head, her expression one of innocent concern. She didn't look at him with the fear or respect that his staff usually showed. She looked at him simply, as a fellow human being. In that look, Vincent saw the truth. He had spent his time hoarding gold and silence, but this child had given him the only thing that truly mattered: life. The sound of frantic footsteps thundered down the hallway. Judith burst into the room, her face pale with terror. When she saw her daughter sitting beside the tycoon, she stopped dead, her breath hitching in her chest. She rushed forward, grabbing Amaya and pulling the toddler close to her side, ready to apologize, ready to lose her job and ready for the worst. But Vincent didn't yell. He didn't even stand up. He just sat on the floor, looking at the two of them, the coldness inside his heart finally beginning to melt away. Vincent stood up, but his usual cold authority was gone. He looked at Judith, who was still trembling, and held up a hand to stop her from apologizing. "There is no need for that," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He realized that the silence in his house had been broken, and for the first time in years, he didn't mind. He walked to his desk and picked up his phone. He didn't call his office or his assistants to discuss business. Instead, he called his personal physician. "I need a specialist here at the estate immediately," he told the doctor on the other end. "It is for a young child. Do not ask questions, just come." He then turned his attention to the room. He walked over to a nearby velvet sofa and gestured for Judith to sit down with Amaya. "She is ill," Vincent stated, not as a command, but as a simple realization. "She needs proper care, and she needs it here." Judith clutched Amaya closer, still shocked by his sudden shift in behavior. "Sir, I didn't mean to." "It does not matter," Vincent interrupted, offering a small, tired smile. "What matters is her health." For the rest of the afternoon, Vincent broke every one of his old routines. He didn't retreat to his study to work in isolation. He stayed in the main living room, waiting for the medical team to arrive. He watched as Judith wrapped her daughter in a warm blanket, and he felt a strange, new sensation in his chest, a sense of responsibility. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a host, and more importantly, he was a protector. When the doctor arrived, Vincent directed them to a bright, comfortable guest suite, ensuring Amaya would have everything she needed to recover. He saw the way Judith looked at him, with confusion and rising hope, and he knew he was walking a new path. The cold, empty mansion was beginning to feel warm, and for the first time, Vincent realized he didn't want the silence to return. He wanted the house to be filled with the sound of life again. Days turned into a week, and the atmosphere in the estate began to shift. The staff noticed it too. The cold, sterile air that had hung over the mansion for years was fading, replaced by the soft, giggling sounds of a toddler finding her strength again. Vincent spent his evenings not in his lonely study, but in the sunroom, watching Amaya play with her toys while Judith worked nearby. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink, Vincent found Judith finishing her tasks. He cleared his throat, his expression uncharacteristically soft. "Judith, may I speak with you for a moment?" Judith paused, wiping her hands on her apron. She still felt a bit nervous around him, despite his recent kindness. "Of course, sir." Vincent sighed, looking around at the beautiful but lifeless rooms. "For a long time I thought this house was perfect. I thought silence was the same thing as peace. But I was wrong. The silence was just another kind of weight." He gestured toward Amaya, who was happily stacking wooden blocks in the corner. "She brought a light into this house that I didn't know I needed. When I look at the two of you, I don't see employees. I see the only real warmth this home has felt in years." He paused, taking a breath to steady his voice. "I have spoken with my legal advisors. I want to make an arrangement for you and Amaya to stay here permanently. Not as staff but as family. I have plenty of space, and I find that I do not want to be alone anymore. Will you stay?" Judith stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock. She looked at the man who had once been a distant, cold figure, now standing before her with a look of genuine hope in his eyes. She looked at her daughter, who was smiling at them both. The crushing weight of her struggle to survive, the worry about rent, and the fear of the future seemed to vanish in an instant. "Sir," she started, her voice shaking with relief, "we would be honored." A few weeks later, the legal papers were finalized in the light-filled sunroom. Vincent signed the last document and set the pen down, feeling a weight lift from his chest that he hadn't realized he was carrying. It was official. Amaya was his daughter, and Judith was an essential part of the family they were building together. The house, once a quiet, cold place, felt completely different now. The high ceilings no longer echoed with silence. Instead, they carried the sound of Amaya's happy squeals as she played. Vincent had moved the heavy, formal chairs aside to make room for a colorful rug and a box of building blocks. The marble floors, which used to seem so sterile, were now covered with toys and the small footprints of a toddler. Vincent walked over to the window. He looked out at the rolling hills, no longer seeing a prison of his own making. He saw a future. He turned back to see Judith helping Amaya put on her shoes, the two of them laughing about something silly. A smile broke across Vincent's face, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes. He walked over to them, feeling a deep sense of belonging he had thought was impossible to find again. He realized that the foundation of his home was no longer just the stone and brick of the building, but the love and trust they shared. "Ready to go to the park?" Vincent asked, his voice warm. Amaya ran over and grabbed his hand, her small grip strong and certain. Judith stood up, her face bright with a peace she hadn't known for years. They walked toward the front door together. As Vincent opened it, letting the bright afternoon sun pour into the entryway, he knew he wasn't leaving an empty house. He was leaving a home. The loneliness that had defined his life for so long had finally been replaced by the chaotic, beautiful, and vibrant noise of a real family. Life had returned to the estate, and for the first time in a very long time, Vincent was exactly where he was meant to be. What started as a lonely, cold mansion is now filled with the laughter of a family. It just goes to show that miracles can happen in the smallest, most unexpected ways. If you enjoyed this journey of hope and second chances, hit that subscribe button. It helps us keep creating stories that make a difference.